Hello and welcome. You're listening to Adventures in the Vale, an RPG discussion podcast. I'm Jake.
I'm Ross.
Sit back and relax by the fire, for there are tales to be told.
Hello, travelers. Welcome to the Cozy Crow. Come and sit by our fire. May I get you something to drink?
Yeah. I'll take an ale.
I'll have that right out.
Welcome to the Cozy Crow Tavern and the Adventures in the Vale Tavern cast, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games. My name's Ross, and I'll be your host here at the tavern tonight. Settle in, order a drink, and let's swap tales of adventure. I'm joined tonight with someone I consider an expert with regard to Dungeon Crawl Classics, a role-playing game I've come to deeply love and enjoy over this past year. And tonight, we're going to talk about that. Introduce yourself. Tell us about you.
Hi, my name's Lane Bowen. I've been playing games for a while, since I started back in the 90s with AD&D 2nd edition. Fell out of it for many years, and now I'm really into Dungeon Crawl Classics, but I've been play what I can and been running my own games for a while now.
So you started with 2nd edition.
Yeah, back in the when I was a middle school and a high school, but it's like when you could go to Walden Books in the mall and get D&D books there and stuff like that. As a kid, that was how I started. But it was just really mostly like me and my brother playing. We didn't actually have anybody else to play with, so we kind of figured it out as we went, sort of thing. Which is seems like now you hear a lot of people did the same thing, but at the time it was just me wanting to get as much as I can in and not really understanding what I'm doing. But good times.
Yeah. Do you ever miss that game? That kind of game, like you and your brother figuring it out together, AD&D 2nd edition?
Well, it's one of those, it's hard to tell, the nostalgia is strong versus, it's hard to recreate, when you go back and look at, I found, I recently moved back to where my mom lived, and she had these boxes of stuff, and I found, all my old, notebooks and world building materials I wrote when I was in middle school, character sheets, and I even back then, the world building part of it was a big draw for me, because I was a big, fantasy nerd and reading lots of, books and, all those old D&D, doorstop books that now are kind of cringy when you go back to them. But, the world building at the time, even I have pages and pages of notebooks of this very derivative fantasy worlds I made up when I was in middle school,
Oh,
going
cool.
back and seeing some of that stuff. Some of it's pretty cringy, but it's also it's cool to have all that stuff again.
I'm going to ask you about Moonthorn later, but is there a little bit of a Moonthorn prototype in any of that? Was there any kind of Moonthorn to come that would eventually inform that?
Not really. So much as the world building drive was there, and that's what kind of was. There may be little bits, but it was very much derivative, standard D&D stuff. My world wasn't really. You had your generic D&D-ified fantasy world. That was pretty much what I was doing. I might have thought I was being super original, but I wasn't even aiming for originality. It was just something I made it my own thing. That kind of made it. But going back and looking at the stuff. Now, Moonthorn is definitely mostly influenced by stuff that I got into after that phase, but still with a nostalgic look back at the whole world building and D&D, aspirational stuff.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, but now you're kind of I think of you, at least for me, to me, you're like the Dungeon Crawl Classics guy. You ran DCC the first time I ever played it, by the way.
Yeah?
Yeah. Sour Spring Hollow, the funnel. That was the first time I ever played it. So how did you get into Dungeon Crawl Classics?
Well, it started kind of, I was, talking about how I played second edition back in the 90s, and of course then I didn't play for 20 years or something like that. And it was around 2012, 2013. I decided, I was an adult. I decided, you know what? My whole life I've been wanting nostalgic, trying to recreate that feel for when I was playing D&D as a kid. So I was like, screw it, I'm getting back into D&D. And at the time, it was all Pathfinder. Pathfinder was just really getting started, and so I fell back into that. And I'd forgotten all the old rules from second edition, so I just relearned it with Pathfinder. And it was fun, but it wasn't really quite clicking. It was, it's somewhat scratching that itch, but it wasn't quite there for that nostalgic kind of thing. And I think that's one of the things that DCC was kind of based on, is nostalgia for games that never were, and sort of thing.
Games that never were.
Yeah, everybody, this, it goes going, off tangent a little bit. The OSR feel is largely people trying to recreate the feelings of what they remember from their childhood games, that when you go back and play them, they weren't exactly. I think a lot of it is nostalgia, but that's a whole other segment you could rant on forever.
Sure.
But I got but that's going back to that. I was played Pathfinder, and I was like, this is D&D now, I guess. I don't remember what it was like before well enough to know that it turns out, no, it's not really. There it is, but it's so much extra baggage, And a friend of mine ran the, I think it was Sailors on the Starless Sea. It was before even the DCC was fully released. I think when they were doing that playtest stuff around 2012, 2013. A friend of mine said, hey, I've heard about this game. It's super old school, and, going back to, and I want to try it out. And he played it, and he ran that for me and another friend of mine and some other people. And I was just like blown away, like, holy cow, this is what I want.
Oh, wow.
This is, it was different enough from, it definitely was a big, I'd gotten back into it and playing Pathfinder first edition. And it's like, holy, this is closer to what I remember D&D being like, but it was still different, but it was in some ways, it really scratched that itch of what I wanted out of D&D, like my whole life. Even back when I was in middle school, trying to get this vibe that I didn't really know what I was doing. And DCC was the closest, I was just blown away by the whole vibe of it, I guess.
So you would say it accomplished that feeling. It actually, the one you're describing, it managed to pull it off.
And not every time you play, but it's the most of any other system that I've tried. Really gets that, what I want, that aspirational, that game that I'm trying to get to, and that I play other systems that kind of scratch that itch but don't quite get it, that are really close. And DCC is the closest I've gotten to that. And it doesn't always get that, but it's certainly closer to anything else.
So you're talking about this sort of feeling that it produces, and I can tell as we kind of talk around that feeling. I mean, there's nostalgia, which would describe maybe why that feeling is there, or but it does seem kind of elusive. What do you think that is? What is it that you got when you were younger, and you had this thing, and you didn't see it again until you tried this game in 2012?
Yeah. Well, I think, even as a kid playing D&D, or even an adult, there's this kind of almost, I don't know, immersive experience. It's a fantasy world that you feel like you're a hero, or you're going through, escapism, and so, to some extent, but really escaping into another world kind of thing is, I think, to some extent, one of the draws and the main vibes that people are going for in D&D. And DCC is the best at accomplishing that of anything I've played, and when done well.
At immersion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think about, so I didn't start with Dungeons and Dragons, but when I got into it really pretty hard. For a long time I was into Dungeons and Dragons, and for me it was 5th edition, and there was this feeling I wanted to attain in Dungeons and Dragons. I had this idea of what it would be, like playing Baldur's Gate, the video games, which I played those games before I got to actually play Dungeons and Dragons. And even just fantasy video games, there was this expectation that I would be this sword-wielding, backpack-wearing, muddy boot-wearing adventurer, and I would have to go to taverns for something. In Baldur's Gate, it was to get information. You had to like buy drinks and get information from the tavern keep, and then you would go out on an adventure, and it would be perilous, and it would be, dark and gritty, and that you wouldn't leave that, But what we found when we really started playing a big campaign of the modern game, I remember in 2020 with the group that we have now, for the first few sessions, there was this sense of wonder that there was this huge world and you were a very small part of it, and you could make choices in it. And they went and they saved a merchant's son from like this really horrific monster, and they thought they might die to try to fight this monster. But immediately after that, they were 3rd or 4th level, and we never had that feeling again. We never came back, and they became like the most important fixtures in the world. And it felt like Marvel's Avengers, where it was like this sort of personal character experience about a very important, very powerful person and how they interact with the world. And we played that for a year and a half, and I think for many of us, we always wanted that first feeling of that, like that first 3 or 4 sessions. And then once we got that past that threshold, I don't know what that is, but once we passed that threshold, it was gone, and we never got it again.
Yeah. Well, and going back thinking my first DCC experience, kind of maybe if we'd kept playing, we would have lost that too. But I remember went through. I think it was the Sailors on the Starless Sea was the first game I played. It was before the books were in actually in print form. But we played it, and it was like, it was amazing. Like, people died left and right, and you finally had these survivors, and they were it meant something that those were the ones that got out. And then we were like, okay, what do we do next? And Adam, who was the one running that, really, to his credit, probably what set the tone for why one of the reasons I like DCC so much and have like always chasing it since then is like the next thing he did after we got down out of that. Somebody was like, well, this wizard wants to learn a spell. He wants to get, it's like, okay. And he's like, all right, well, here, let me, he played around. I don't know, he's probably making it up, and he rolled some dice, pretended like he was looking at something, and said, okay, well, you've heard about this old hermit in this weird valley that, that might have a lead on spell. So the next thing we did right after, the funnel was we had to go, and we went to this remote valley with this narrow trail that went to this weird hermit, and he had and that was just to learn a spell.
Yeah, wow.
Whereas, Fifth Edition, modern, like even Pathfinder, all those modern thing is like, well, you leveled up and here's your spells.
Right.
It's like, it's just, you're just going through
the adventure happens off the screen,
right.
I had a table result like that the other day where I told somebody it was like I had a party, but someone else had to tell me about it. And that, and that's what, and I've always had that problem with wizard spell tables in D&D, where you kind of automatically learn a spell because it just seemed like something really interesting was happening in the background, and we were just zooming into the fight, but none of the mystery and wonder and exploration of it. That part had kind of been taken out. Okay, so that was like 10 years ago. So here you are. You've been playing and running Dungeon Crawl Classics for 10 years. This is an old RPG at this point, interestingly. And
yeah.
So now there's all kinds of stuff that's come out. Some of it has some of the vibes and the energy of Dungeon Crawl Classics. You've got things like, and this is kind of old at this point too, but you had games like Shadow of the Demon Lord. You've got Warhammer Fantasy, which is of course older, but it's obvious that DCC draws inspiration from it. You've got Shadow Dark, which is almost like a light version of it on one level. You've got things like Dungeon Crawl Classics after 10 years why Dungeon Crawl Classics? Why are you still running and playing? What's kept you in it throughout that time?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. Some of it may be going back. Maybe I'm just doing the nostalgia cycle all over again. Who knows? But I think more than that, well, some of it is I'm invested. I'm sure because I've been.
Yeah, but do you have fun when you run it?
Yeah, that definitely helps because I ran. Part of it, I was running a lot of. I got back into it playing Pathfinder. Then I found out about DCC, but still finding players at that point even was like, okay, but I still played Pathfinder, and then on one every other week or so I would finally get to play DCC with another friend of mine who's been run a game at a game store, but it was never quite got that critical mass of all the other players playing the other systems. And then I moved. I was living in Alabama at the time, in Birmingham. Then I moved to Kentucky, where everybody was playing 5th edition instead of Pathfinder, and so I ended up running a lot of 5th edition. But even then, I made my own setting, and I made a setting which turned into what's now Moonthorn. It was still Moonthorn, but it was different. It was like Moonthorn in the past. Anyway, getting in the weeds there. But even then, I basically made a setting specifically so that I could try and trick people into playing DCC. Because Moonthorn started as a 5e game designed to rip off DCC so that I could hopefully get players to then play DCC. And that's...
I don't know if that worked, but I'm playing it. So
yeah, it didn't really work at all. I got stuck in a 5e campaign that went for years. But I threw in all this corruption rules for 5th edition that were basically just ripping off the corruption rules from DCC.
But you're running it now, and I mean, I can say, so I think 2 years ago, I made 2 characters. So one of them was a 5th edition character, a swamp dwarf or something, but I was only on one adventure for that character. But I made this guy. And he is a confidence man. He's a scam artist, and he owns a raft, and a horse appears in places. He doesn't ride it. He wouldn't want to if he could. It doesn't, it's not his companion or his pet. It just stares at him. It just shows up places, and horrible things happen to people whenever I try to even integrate into normal society and find a place. And I think this was 2 years ago. I appeared next to someone having been captured and brought into basically a torture chamber where they were trying to magically experiment on us, and we escaped. And that was it when I entered into this world. And over 2 years, in a very picaresque and pulpy way, because it's been very off and on, this guy who's this scam artist trying to survive in what is a horrible place, and trying to find food to eat. And I can't, even on this podcast, I can't say some of the things he's seen because of how horrific some of the things he's seen has been. I've gotten to adventure there. And I mean, so now to me, this is this secondary world. It's this place that for me is quite real, and I really enjoy it. What is Moonthorn?
Well, thank you. That's all. That's like mission accomplished. That's what I'm going for.
Yeah, that's what I guess I'm saying is I think
yeah.
I mean, yeah, you run Moonthorn now, and it's in Dungeon Crawl Classics, so it's really cool. It's one of the most unique fantasy settings I've ever seen before.
Well, thank you. Cool. Yeah, because it started, like I said, the setting started as like me trying to figure out a way to shoehorn DCC stuff into 5th edition, and it was always really made to be a DCC campaign. And I finally cut all, had to basically start all. I've had one campaign that was it was a 5th edition campaign that went a long time, and it basically ended where I said the world almost ended. There was like almost an apocalypse, and then they saved it. And then that was like when I was done with 5th edition. And then I decided I'm going to jump 100 years in the future and make it this ruined city and stuff. And then I ended up playing that in 5th edition, but until I killed that.
Let's
again
say someone has never
DCC.
played a role-playing game before. They don't know what a role-playing game is. and they're entering this fantasy world. Like they get transplanted there as a person. What is this place? What is?
Yeah. So Moon Throne is very very much inspired by DCC Lankmar. I really wanted to run DCC Lankmar, and I was but I wanted to do my own world building.
And
so
DCC Lankmar is, of course, there's this almost lore to Dungeons and Dragons I didn't even know existed, and then I read it and I was like, oh, this is Dungeons and Dragons. And I feel like I didn't even really know until I read it. This guy Fritz Lieber, he wrote this a multiple series, a whole omnibuses of novels set in with his kind of two main adventurer characters called Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, right? And Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are generally not nice people, and they're just trying to get a buck and get by another day in what is this sort of, I don't know how you'd even describe it, but a sort of mudcore Mesopotamian world where, and again, some of it I can't really describe on this podcast, but magic is dangerous and horrific, but they have to act that, but they still contend with it so that they can try to get money and power because they're hungry for money and power, and it keeps driving them into horrific places so they can get more money and power, and then they come back and they blow it all in the tavern on bad habits, and that drives them back out into. Anyways, in case somebody doesn't know what Lankmar is, but go ahead.
Yes. So Moon Throne is basically my urban metropolis setting, but the city has gone to crap because the world almost ended, and then it didn't, but the city never recovered. So it's basically, and to add some of the DCC elements, one of the things I love about DCC is the corruption rules, how wizards are like dangerous and they can be twisted and corrupted by using magic. So I basically took that and I ran with it, where the idea is there's this city and something about the city is off. So
the whole city has that character to it, not just a single wizard anymore.
Exactly. The whole city is rife with magical corruption, that incursions can happen, and just it's dangerous to go there in certain areas.
Give one example. Like, what would happen if, and because again, people listening, they don't know what Dungeon Crawl Classics is. So, what's something that could happen when you meddle with magic?
Right. So in Dungeon Crawl Classics, like if a wizard sort of botches a spell check, for example, he may be corrupted, and like for one of the examples is his head may slowly be turning into a frog head.
Great. Yeah.
Like he starts off, you just get bulbous eyes like a frog, and the more you mess up your spell, but eventually you just got a literal frog head. It's like, oh, that's a wizard. You can tell because he's the one who's all messed up.
Yeah. He just has a frog head. Yes. I've seen this happen with magic. These things. Okay, so you're saying the whole city does stuff like that? Like the whole city is a sort of living creature that has been afflicted by this corruption and
Yes. So like the boundaries between worlds are thin there, you could say. So corruption from other planes of reality, and I can get into the weeds of the metaphysics of it, but you don't need to know all that. It's just the city will change you. To steal a line from another supplement I'm using. But,
one thing I can say as a player is you can start on one city block and you can travel to the next city block in that place, and it will be tense and dramatic and very weird and horrific and interesting. And there's hardly any like, oh, I think I'll just have a light shopping day here today in Moon Throne. Like it's a place where maybe that happens. Maybe somebody could be lucky and have a day like that. But there are some strange days for people that travel there. So that was my experience with it.
Yep, that sounds about right. And I'm still working on my rules for it, but I've got the setting down, and I'm basically cobbling rules from DCC and trying to come up with my own sort of, everybody. You hear hex crawl is. People do hex crawls, and the systems for hex crawls I've never quite grasped, so I'm trying to make my own and figuring out how to integrate that into the setting, because world building is a big part of it, the draw for me.
Yeah. All right, so someone's listening to this, and I'm going to do a whole thing on this in my review, because I feel like Dungeon Crawl Classics is a game that suffers from layers of misconceptions. Like there's like especially a couple of things that I think people look at it and they have misconceptions that just hold them back from trying it out. And lots of people could try it. The quick start rules are free. Actually, I will say the second one is a D6 can be a D3 and you can hop in and play a funnel. You don't need to try to get funky dice. It's not a big deal. This game is not that hard to just hop in and play, especially if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say that you're a new player and you're coming into Dungeon Crawl Classics. What would you recommend for them? What are some things that they should, some things, maybe some advice you would give a new player?
Yeah. Well, first let me say I may have gotten a little sidetracked talking about my own game, which is like Dungeon Crawl Classics with my own house.
No, I
rules,
wanted to know about it. Yeah.
So if anybody was hearing my stuff, just talking to me, describing my game and going, "Ooh, I don't know about that," don't take that as a knock on DCC.
Well, actually, I mean, I think that's a big part of the community, right? Is actually there are all these wild settings, and there's this chaotic fractal of community content. Like the community itself is almost a major character in the game.
Yeah, well, when you asked why DCC as opposed to other systems, that's one of the major reasons. Is the the DCC community is one of the best ones I've found as far as people into a game system. Because I mean, a lot of kudos on that I think goes to Goodman Games. So maybe I'm kind of a Goodman Games fanboy at this point, but so are most DCC fans at this point, because the company that does it, puts out Dungeon Crawl Classics, is very good about embracing the community, and like there's not really a distinction between third-party content and official content. I mean, arguably, yes, you can tell when something's third-party versus Goodman Games' official publication, but even the company blurs those lines and embraces the community on a level that I don't see other game companies quite matching.
It feels like you're at a convention or a party or someone's house, like to just interact with the company and the products and other people that play it is one of the most welcoming and open kind of tabletop role-playing game communities I've ever seen. It's just and it happens naturally. There's this sort of energy or attitude to it that just allows that to come out.
Yeah, I mean, and just to run with that, I mean, the game, like you said, is at this point is kind of an old game. It's been out for over 10 years. They still have the core book, which is, there's been multiple reprints and editions of it, but the rules are the same, and they're not going to be the same. So, there are lots of new games that kind of have come, around since in the past 10 years that kind of, like you were saying, meet some of the vibes. And they're great games. I've played some of them and I really like them. But DCC is still the same game, and it's been around. And, at this point, like the other one's like, okay, I respect and I like what you're doing, but I've already got a game that does that. That
is a feature. I mean, you found a game you love, and it is that game. And there's no third edition of it or fifth edition or eighth edition. Warhammer Fantasy, like I use that as an example, but you're talking about some different games between first, second, third, and fourth edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Dungeon Crawl Classics, there's a 8th or 9th or 10th reprint. I don't know what they're on now, but it's Dungeon Crawl Classics. It's the same game, and that's a feature.
And I may have a problem when it comes to Goodman Games Kickstarters. I've got, I think, 3 core books now, and it's the same rules. I mean, the art's different. They change the art a little bit every now and then.
And now you have like DCC Linkmar and Mutant Crawl Classics and this massive zine culture where you have, like, I've played elements of Space Crawl Classics we had like Crawl Jammer, like Spell Jammer, but it's Dungeon Crawl Classics, and all sorts of stuff. So anyways, you mentioning Moonthorn, I think, is very much in the character of the game. At least my experience as a DCC player.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of, like I say, that was kind of the inspiration, was to try and make a setting to really kind of play with some of the things I loved about DCC. And at this point, I'm trying to embrace that culture, but also make my own thing and try to make it a unique, not derivative. While it's clearly, I could name a lot of the influences.
Derivative.
But it is, but I can say influences that I'm. It feels to me like, well, you don't hear a lot of people saying, well, my main influence for my D&D thing is, China Mieville's Bass Lag books and and Jeff Vandermeer's Ambergris cycle and stuff like that. There is a few that I've found that reference those things, but I mean, those are my influences. I'm like, oh yeah, if anybody would pay attention, they'll see I'm just totally ripping this off, and this off. That
So let's say you're a new player. You're going to play in a Dungeon Crawl Classics game. It could be somebody's homebrew. It could be a zine. It could be Sailors on the Starless Sea. Which is how a lot of people funnel, pun intended, their way in. So, what would you suggest to someone who's a new player?
Well, first thing, don't let the rules get in the way. Like that's the rules in DCC are people coming from more crunchy games or there's a rule for this and a rule for that. DCC specifically goes out of its way to not do that. Some people I've heard criticize it like the rules in the books are vague and contradictory. And I say, yeah, that's actually somewhat on purpose. Who knows if it was when the first revision, maybe it wasn't, but at this point, no, that's intentional.
Yeah.
Because it's the rules, as it says in the book, the judge is the final say on the rules, and there is no hard and fast rule that it has to be this way. If you have a house rule, talking about the way the community goes, I played DCC with a few different judges, some of which have been associated with the actual, Goodman Games and some not. Like Brendan LaSalle's a big name in the DCC community. He's got this X-Crawl thing coming up. I ran in a game with him, and he had his own house rules that were not in the book. But it was, everybody has their own house rules, and they're not really contradictory. Right. The book is vague on purpose, and there's a lot of things I've heard players get kind of, in the weeds, like, well, it says this on this page, but it counter it. It's like, yes, whichever one you prefer.
Yeah, I'd almost say, maybe don't even worry about the rules too much. Like, if you're showing up and you're playing, especially if you're doing a funnel.
Yeah, it's like, don't let the rules stop you. Don't let them get in their way. They're vague for a reason. Basically, embrace if you want to do something, don't worry about just my character has the set. Am I optimized for this? Just do it.
Yeah, nice.
DCC definitely embraces that. Because first off, 3d6 down the line, don't worry about your stats. The stats don't really matter. They help a little bit. They're going to add some nuance to your dice rolls. But can I do something or can I do something? Your stats, ignore those. And just, add the modifiers, but don't get stuck on them.
That's an interesting change is you'll roll this character and they'll have I don't know, they'll have a 3 or a 6 in intelligence or something, or 5 or 4. And you'll be like, oh, I can't use this character. No, my friend. This is going to be the hero of the story, actually. You just don't know it yet.
Especially if you're in a funnel and you got 4 characters. Yeah. I'm sorry, that's going to be the one that survives. Yeah. It always works that way.
And they become this endearing character that everyone remembers, and they become really interesting because of flaws. Yeah. It has it has the story built into it that way. Exactly,
and embrace the emergent narrative. Don't look for the rules. Just play the character as you want. If you have an idea you want to do something, try it. That character might die. You'll roll a new one, and that's part of the fun, especially in a funnel. But if be creative with what you want to do with your players, and don't let your optimization stop you. Especially, also, just a side note, if you're playing a warrior in DCC, definitely be creative, and just if you want to try something, try it. You have a mechanic. The warrior is the best fighter class of any game system I think I've ever read.
I can agree with that
because it's got the deed die is a thing of beauty. Is the best mechanic in any game. I think just if you're unfamiliar, basically warriors get a deed die instead of your standard I get a +1 to hit at level 1. Warriors get a die they roll every time they attack, and if you get say a 3 or higher on that deed die, whatever awesome thing you said you want to accomplish goes off.
Yeah.
So when I say if you want to do something, try it. Especially as a warrior, if you have some awesome thing you want to pull off, at least ask to do it. The judge might say, let's tone it down. That's a little much. Like I want to decapitate this guy. Well, that might be a little much, but we'll.
I felt we had enough XP in a funnel, so we're like, all right, let's level up because we'd come to this moment. And so there was this warrior, and he rolled, his D die went off, and he took this magic spear that had been imprisoned on another plane of existence and leapt 100 feet through the air on the head of a titan and drove it through its brain and killed it at level 1,
Yeah.
Or another one, there was a level 4 fighter, and he also had a magic spear, and there was a fledgling frog god, like a baby god of Bobugmabills, and he ripped its belly out, and he ended with this like anime spear over the shoulder, not looking back, like a cool guy kind of move, and slew it in one hit, And you can do all this kind of crazy stuff that you're like, in regular D&D, you're like, why can't I do this? If I'm so heroic, why can't... And in DCC, it's like, yeah, you could do that.
Yeah, especially like in DCC, it's like, well, you can try. You can always try.
Yeah.
And, some people have taken that as, DCC is too over the top, and, I don't want to play a game that is that. To that, I'd say, that's really the judge's discretion. So it's not, I don't think the game is necessary. I mean, we may disagree on this one. The game isn't inherently over the top. It's just, it lets you be. And it really depends on the game the judge wants to.
That's
roll.
an interesting
For example,
way to look at it. Like it allows for it.
Like you mentioned, doing this awesome deed where, you jumped 100 feet in the air, and it's like, yeah, that's the game that everybody was on board for. That's the game the judge wanted to run.
Yeah.
If a judge wants to run a lesser tone game, then he just has to be willing to go, no, but, or, like tone it down a little bit. And it was like, well, that's a great idea. I'm going to spin it this way, and maybe it's not quite so
That's a good point.
over the top. But that's the judge can kind of control the dials, so to speak, to the level of crazy Gonzo is really variable, but it does have a reputation for being only over the top, and just because a lot of the community loves that, and I do too, but it doesn't have to be. That's one thing I'd say with DCC.
Okay, well, Lane, I just love talking about this. I could talk about Dungeon Crawl Classics for days. I'm going to include this in my review, but 2023 was like Dungeon Crawl Classics year, and we in the server we had like 5 or 6 different major games and campaigns and situations and things going on with Dungeon Crawl Classics over the period of a year, and it has been a blast. I will say at the end here, one thing I can say about the game is I can't really quantify why this is the case, but I play Dungeon Crawl Classics and I end up having fun. And there are games that I love that's not the case. I play them and I might not have fun, but there's some sort of attitude, some kind of energy in Dungeon Crawl Classics, and I end up I play it, I have fun. It's formulaic, it's weird like that. But anyways, are there any TTRPG projects that you're working on right now? And if so, where can people find you and talk to you about it?
Well, the main thing I'm always working on is my own little homebrew setting that I feel like I've.
Is it still open table?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So if you're
room
on the
pending available room or whatever. So hypothetically, I mean, it's open to new victims. I mean explorers, players.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, if you were on the Mythic Mountain server and wanted to try it out or even look anything up, you just hit me up on that. I don't have any. It's one of those. I've got my in-house document that I'm working on, and I'm working on all these extra rules for it. So that my main big project is like DCC Moonthorn is kind of like my home side project. That who knows? Maybe one day I'll actually try and put out a zine or something. That's not really a goal right now. It's just having fun with the world building is my jam with that. So that's my big project that I'm always working on. I call it a play test now because like I said, I've moved over. I've kind of rebuilt the setting again specifically for a style of DCC that I want to try out, which is basically a mix of hex crawl and urban shenanigans. And I think you played the last game we played. Were you there for that one? Yeah. Was the the playtest the first time we got to the more urban shenanigans, I felt like, I need a lot of work on that. So that's the big project I'm working on, is trying to get this balance of my niche style of DCC that I want to run.
Yeah.
As far as places to find me, there's always the Mythic Mountains server, if anybody's on that listening. And my son had a Tumblr blog that's... he just put up moonthronemonsters.tumblr, I think, where he's basically taken drawings that I did of like monsters and stuff in Moonthrown, and he's like doing little descriptions of them. If anybody's on
That's
Tumblr,
great.
you can do a search for Moonthrown monsters. It's intermittently updated, but it's got, some weird stuff that I've come up with, and my teenage son has written little write-ups on them.
That's awesome. Well, we'll include links to that stuff in the description, and Lane, thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to us about Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Anytime, thanks.
Mythic Mountains RPG is a private online play club that focuses on folk RPGs. Folk RPGs are the games that belong to all of us. They're what actually happens at a table between friends. It's their voice that has the authority on what is fun and what works for them. Weekly, we upload our games to allow others to sit in with us. The channel isn't monetized. We don't own the artwork, music, software, or games shown in these actual plays, and you can find links to their authors in the description. Like, subscribe, and share if you wish, or don't. Just like games in person, you're welcome to pull up a chair, sit in, and watch some of our games. No performances, no fancy equipment, just regular people playing folk pencil and paper role-playing games and having a good time. We hope these games will prove a source of enjoyment to anyone just wanting to listen in, anyone looking for examples of how actual groups run and play folk RPGs, and most importantly, if you haven't found your group yet, you're welcome here at ours.